welcome back, folks, to the Tuesday Night Bison Chat. Galen Clavio joining you once again. Happy to be with you on this show. We've got Joe Cronin back again, our co-host on the show, and we welcome in Nick Rourke, who called the game this past weekend as IU took on Charlotte. Nick, welcome for the first time to the show. Great to have you here.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
We got Emily Fox, ace producer behind the scenes, making all of the pictures work and the sounds come through. We will be calling on her to play some video clips as we go on throughout here. But Joe Cronin, last week we talked about Indiana coming off a big win at UCLA, maybe a little bit of a hangover potentially. They end up, after a little bit of a slow start, having a heck of a game as they decisively defeat the Charlotte 49ers at Memorial Stadium this past Saturday.
Yeah, Galen, something we mentioned last week was how this one was a tune-up game, making sure all the pieces were squared away heading into the heart of Big Ten play. And it was 17-14 at one point in the first half, and it was like, hey, what's going on here? But then 35 unanswered. This team had their foot on the gas on both sides of the ball the entirety of it. I mean, players were making plays everywhere. The receiving room is talented. They have guys like 4 or 5 deep that can just go out there and make a play on some solid corners. And it's something that there's a lot of excitement building around this team. And I think they've done the job in this first 4 weeks, and especially the manner of which they've won these non-conference games. It's hopeful, at least for people who might have been a little more pessimistic heading into the year. But Curt Cignetti, he's undaunted up to this point.
Nick, as you can see, this is really when Indiana started to open things up right at the end of the second, beginning of the third. What did you see calling this game, and what stuck out to you the most?
I was really, really impressed with Indiana's ground game. I mean, I think they had 6 rushing touchdowns in this game, and it just seemed like they were winning up front on both sides of the ball really decisively. I was also impressed with just how great Curtis was at, being decisive with the ball, being quick to, make the decisions that he made. He was smart with the ball. And then defensively, I mean, Indiana, one thing that kind of stuck out to me that wasn't necessarily a positive was kind of the rushing defense. Like Coach Sig kind of talked about it yesterday, how he didn't feel like their energy was there. He didn't feel like they were swarming the ball the way they have in past games. He didn't feel like the energy was up as high as it could have been. I'm interested to see if that's a focal point in practice this week, because Maryland's certainly going to see that as something they can attack.
One of the big standouts for Indiana in an offensive game, frankly, where there weren't a lot of standouts because it was so evenly distributed across the board, was Justice Ellison, the running back. Had another big game, 9 carries, 58 yards, a touchdown, 6.5 yards a carry. We were talking about this on the Crimson Cast Mothership show this weekend, but Indiana already with 18 rushing touchdowns through 4 games. They had 13 rushing touchdowns for the entirety of the 2023 season, Joe. I mean, the rushing attack is something to be reckoned with for this IU team.
Yeah, this team is scoring at a tremendous rate. They're punching it in the end zone. Their red zone efficiency is tremendous up to this point. And Justice Ellison, on the season, he's averaging 7.5 yards per carry. I understand the caliber of these opponents that he's faced, but I mean, you got to give credit where credit is due. The offensive line has been dogs. There's been credit given to them by both Cignetti and as well as Rourke, some of the receivers, running backs as well. But the 1-2 punch of Tyson Lawton and Justice Ellison, I mean, that's going to give really any kind of defense the fritz, because those are 2 very capable running backs. They protect the rock well, and they're able to find the holes that the offense is giving them.
You mentioned Curtis Rourke a little bit earlier, Nick, and Curt Cignetti had some really positive words about his upperclassman quarterback in the press conference that happened just a couple of days ago.
Well, he's in command. He's playing with a lot of confidence. He's seeing the field. He's making the throws. When the pattern breaks down, he's running for yards, touchdowns, first downs. The guys have a lot of confidence in him. You can really see it all coming together. And I thought as the game went on, he really was sharp. We scored 35 straight points. We took him out with time left in the third quarter. We probably could have kept rolling. But he's playing very well right now.
Yeah, you do think as daunting to other teams as this offensive performance is. They really let their foot off the gas in this one. And Taven Jackson had a couple of throws lined up that just he couldn't quite complete. I mean, you could have been talking about another 60-point-plus performance for this IU team. Even without that, their offensive statistics, their EPA per play, like pretty much every metric has been off the charts. And that all, of course, is largely adjusted for opponent. I mean, it's not like Indiana's just racking up yards and points against bad teams. Some of the teams have been bad, but they've, even with that in context, been really taking advantage of the efficiency that this offense has shown.
Yeah, they're not, just staying out there and just beating the brakes off their opponents, like turning the difficulty down to rookie and just chucking up 80-yard deep balls. It's the way that they're dominating their opponents. And, Curtis Rourke is not, like taking deep shots every single play. He's being smart. And, his completion percentage is really, really high. He's very, he's really decisive. He's smart. It's a balanced attack. And that's something that's been really impressive about Curtis is that, I didn't have him rushing for a touchdown on my bingo card this weekend, but the play broke down. He saw something up in front of him and he made it happen. That's exactly what Indiana, I think, wanted with him as a veteran guy. And they've got to be thrilled with what they've gotten so far.
Joe, you're always a little bit worried when a quarterback that's had a leg injury or a knee injury is scrambling. But it was interesting on going back and watching the television broadcast replay the last couple of days. You can always tell what the coaches want to get across to the broadcasters by what the broadcasters bring up in about the first 10 minutes of the broadcast. And they really made a point of they think that Curtis Rourke, that there's 8 to 10 yards out there for him on a lot of these plays because defenses are dropping back so deep because they're afraid of this Indiana passing attack. And Rourke is savvy enough now to know when to run, know when to slide, know when to get out of bounds, and know when the yards are there. And it's really a key to an efficient offense and something that was kind of a new wrinkle in the Charlotte game, this idea that you don't have to throw every single time. You've got another way to get the ball down the field a little bit.
Yeah, Rourke doesn't need to be a Lamar Jackson or Jalen Milroe within the system. He has weapons on the outside that he can get things quickly. They run a lot of RPOs, so the running backs are going to get their touches. The wide receivers are going to get their touches. But if a play breaks down, he has the mobility to extend some plays and break up for, like you said, 8 to 10 yards. And I was talking to some guys yesterday, I think, and it kind of looks like he runs in slow motion, but I think it's just because he's a 6'5", 230 guy. Like his strides are taking up, 2 to 3 yards. So it may not look fast, but he's able to cover some ground. And it's something it's kind of subtly one of his strengths that he's not going to use it a ton, only 4 carries, but you add a touchdown, you add 8 yards for those carries. It could be a dangerous, just another asset that this offense already has a ton of assets on their side. I
also look like I'm running in slow motion when I run, and as a 230-pound guy, I'll use that as an excuse next time. No, I think overall, and also it's interesting looking at the defense in this game. That was a bit of a concern in that first half. Charlotte was able to move the ball. They had a couple of nice long runs that were a little bit surprising. But, Nick, they really clamped down after that second touchdown that Charlotte scored, and Charlotte really struggled to do anything from that point on.
Yeah, I think Indiana kind of just realized that if Charlotte was going to beat them, it was going to be on the ground. So they forced Charlotte into passing downs. And from there, the secondary was just so strong. And if Charlotte was completing anything, it was a high percentage short distance pass. And the tackles were being made immediately on the passing side. And I think from that front, you have to be thrilled with how the secondary performed, even without D'Angelo Pons, who was out for the first half of that game. But Charlotte was starting a walk-on quarterback, and you knew that, the passing game was going to be their bigger weakness. So once Indiana, I think, kind of realized how heavily Charlotte was going to lean on the run, I think they made the adjustment. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the locker room at halftime just to kind of hear what was said to the defense.
Go ahead, Joe, please.
With the Charlotte offense, it was a lot of quick hitters, like Nick said, a lot of pre-snap motion, fake reverses. Sometimes they kept it on the reverse and then into a screen. So nothing was really moving down the field as far as distance, but they were able to carve up. It was 2, maybe 3 drives that just kind of caught that defense on their toes for a bit, but they adjusted. And once again, they shut them out in the second half on a 35-0 run to close out the game, which 35-0 is crazy.
Yeah, no, it's this team can score in bunches and can stop the other team from moving the ball. It'll be interesting to see how that goes against the better competition of conference play. But they already played UCLA on the road and did essentially the same thing to them. A brief wellspring of offensive potency for UCLA, and then essentially back to zero. As the mighty Steve points out in the comments here, there was bound to be some kind of hangover effect coming off the UCLA win and the defense adjusted, which is true. And yeah, look, every team does things a little bit differently, and the defense has to adjust. I mean, it was clear that Charlotte was really going to try to emphasize the screen pass. They did that a few times in that first half to great effect. They gained some yards, gained some first downs, and then that largely got snuffed out as the game went along. And, you know, that's one of the big things about playing defense. It's something Indiana's going to have to do as they go into Big Ten. The bulk of Big Ten play is adapt to things that they're not expecting the opposing team's offense to do defensively. And another great game for Aiden Fisher, the leading tackler in every game so far this season for IU, and really just inheriting that McFadden role as the linchpin of the IU defense, which is great to see.
That's something that's always surprising to me is his PFF grade is one of the lowest on the teams, which is just kind of stands out. It's like, why? I'm seeing him make plays. It seems like half the plays that are made defensively are him, whether it's a broken up ball, whether it's a hard tackle for loss, something like that. So I don't really take into account how much that PFF grade goes into it. He's passing the eye test from what I've seen in 4 games. He's been tremendous, a leader on that team. And the guys around him, they rally behind him. We've talked to guys like Amari Farrell, Josh Sanguinetti, and they say, like, Fish is the one talking in reference to Aiden Fisher.
Comment from Thomas Jonas here. It's nice to have a staff who understands and communicates what adjustments need to be made. I mean, and again, it's one of those where we've talked about this a bit on the main show. It stuck out in a bad way, I thought, for Indiana last couple of years on both sides of the ball. The lack of adjustments, especially post halftime, where, you know, it always felt like Indiana was being countered. And that's not what it feels like with this staff. Like, this staff is really very savvy, and if you pay attention in the post game comments from Signetti, he will kind of tip like, well, yeah, we kind of saw that on film a bit. It's interesting. Like, he even did that in the pre-game press conference with this Maryland team. I'm very fascinated what he saw on film since he spent so much time looking at it during the summer. I think he's clearly had this game circled on his calendar. Before we get to the Maryland game, we did have some interesting questions and comments here. Ross, back again. Ross, thanks for watching. Always appreciate you being a part of the audience. Could IU actually become a football school? The math, Sig's personality, plus a repeatable, proven programmatic approach to building winning programs, plus future unbrutal schedules would seem to pave the way to something special. What's more likely, multiple bowl wins over the next 10 years or multiple Elite Eight appearances for the men's basketball team? Thoughts and feelings? Joe, let me start with you on that. I mean, first of all, that's really a 2-part question. Like, football school feels like a big lift for Indiana. It's like, could Wake Forest become a football school? Like, the culture just doesn't quite seem like it's there, but culture has to build from somewhere. And I think we've got a lot of examples, including, obviously, I mean, Indiana. Like, when Indiana had that wonderful 2019 season and they had the 2020 season that went along, there was genuine interest in football, particularly among students. It is interesting, though, the thought about, like, what Signetti brings to the table, his personality, this kind of no-nonsense approach, but this programmatic approach to developing talent, that does seem sustainable, especially if Indiana is free of the dungeon known as the Big Ten East that they've been chained in for the last decade.
It is really interesting that the comment Ross brings up. Obviously, was thinking a little of the small big picture of this past 4 weeks, but he's thinking this long-term aspect outlook. And it's, when you look at it, it goes to if this team is able to maintain some of their key pieces, as in Signetti and his 2 coordinators, Bryant Haynes and Shanahan, because those 2 are tremendously important to what has gone into the culture of this team, both of them coming from JMU, have followed around with Signetti. They're young guys as well, so I imagine they're going to be getting some phone calls if this team continues on that upwards trend. But like you said, Galen, you got to start from somewhere. Culture just doesn't happen. And I think with Indiana, it's the best example of it's starting from almost nothing. This is the first Power 5 team or Power 4 now to have 700 losses, one of the losingest teams in all of college football. And to suddenly implement this winner's mentality, it's going to be hard to actually have the response from the public, from the fans, to be able to draw in. And I think to become a true football school, it's going to take more than just 1 year. I think there can be, towards the end of the season, a full Memorial Stadium, but I don't think it'll be a full football school until they get, I'd say, 3 to 4 years of this consistent 8-9 win performance. And we haven't even seen that yet. They're only at 4.
Nick, one of the distinctive things about this era is that it's theoretically easier now to build a football program than it used to be at a place that doesn't have a big history of football because of the transfer portal, because of NIL, but also because of all the player movement. I mean, I think the thing that stuck out to me and what's most impressive about Cignetti, maybe more than anything else, is how he has taken kind of bits and pieces of last year's team, of his JMU players, of players from Wake Forest and North Carolina and all these other spots, and very quickly melded them into a unit that seems to have a lot of cohesion and really seems to know what it's doing out on the field. I mean, I didn't expect that to happen that quickly, and I felt like I was one of the wildly optimistic ones about Cignetti.
Yeah, it's, a lot of JMU fans are like, well, this is just JMU West. It's really not. I mean, they brought over like 13 guys, but Curtis Rourke did not come over from James Madison. So it's really been really impressive just to see how Indiana's been able to do this. And Cignetti talked about it back in Indianapolis in July. He said they're going to have to do basically the same thing next year. So for him, I think it's a formula that works where he brings in a lot of veteran guys, makes, kind of maybe tailors the scheme around them, whatever strengths those players seem to have. And he's won everywhere he's been with it so far. But I do think it's going to take more time for, people to really buy in, at least from the general public, just because, a lot of people are probably skeptical, like, oh, at some point the bottom's going to fall out and this will just be the same old Indiana, just because that's what Indiana fans, even like me, got so used to over the years. It's like at some point it's going to go wrong. It's just a question of when. And it's unfortunate, but that's kind of the way it's been.
You only fight those sorts of feelings with victories. I mean, the easiest way to make people forget about the bad times is to create new good times that they then are able to shower themselves with. And that's going to be fascinating. And I think, to me, one of the things I've been hammering on social media is like, go enjoy this team. Like, this team is doing things offensively that we've not seen Indiana teams ever do, and that we're not seeing many teams in college football do right now. I do think this Maryland game this weekend is going to be a big barometer for a lot of fans. This is when I think many of them will really start paying attention, and it's going to be really fascinating to see what happens in that game. We have an interview. Joe Cronin, earlier on today, I think it was able to talk with Jeff Ehrman from the 24/7 sports site covering Maryland. He had some thoughts on Maryland and the matchup and things like that. Let's go ahead and go to those comments now.
Ehrman of Inside MD Sports, the founder of Inside MD Sports, is from the branch of the 247 Sports Tree. Jeff, welcome into the Bison Chat.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Now, Jeff, Maryland and IU playing this week, Week 5 football. Maryland having their second Big Ten game, IU having their second Big Ten game. I mean, Maryland's 3-1 of the year. What have you noticed so far from the Terrapin season?
I'd say most people expected them to be 3-1 or 4-0 at this point. Obviously, the big blemish is that loss at home against Michigan State, one that they really let get away. They had, I think, a 94% win probability at one point in the fourth quarter. Offensively, they've been really good. Billy Edwards, first year starting quarterback, not Talia Tagovailoa in terms of like airing it out deep, but they've devised a very quick, short, quick hitter kind of offense where he's getting the ball out very quickly, usually to Ty Felton, who's leading the Big Ten. I think, has something like 17 more catches or 14 more catches and 242 more yards than any other receiver in the Big Ten. So he's off to a huge start. One of maybe the best start by a Maryland receiver ever. Catch there, obviously, is that competition, to some extent, like Indiana, has not been that great. So we'll see if he can keep that going during Big Ten play.
I want to talk about Billy Edwards a bit. Obviously, with Tagovailoa, that's, all-time leader in passing yards in the Big Ten. But it seems like he's been filling the shoes pretty well. I mean, like you mentioned, a bit of a different schematically things, but have you noticed him kind of fill in that role? Obviously, he's been able to sit behind him for these past couple seasons.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't have maybe the raw talent in terms of throwing or even speed that Talia had, but he is a very smart, poised guy. When if there's any mistake, he bounces right back. He's the unquestioned team leader, gets guys into the right spots. And so, his arm, I think, is a little bit better than people realize. That's part of it too, but more he's just making the right decisions and not making mistakes. That's what Mike Loxley asked for out of him, and that's what he's been doing. He has 2 interceptions so far this year. Both of them came on tipped passes. Otherwise, there haven't been many mistakes. You know, he's completing 75% of his passes, less than I think he's a 0.5% below Curtis Rourke in that category, and averaging about 280 yards a game. So he's been everything they could have hoped for and more, I would say.
Now, I guess with Billy Edwards matching up against this IU defense, this is an IU defense that brings in a lot of transfers. A lot of their best defensive players are the transfers from James Madison. I mean, those 2 middle linebackers there. I mean, what do you expect out of him in a game like this, knowing that this IU defense is probably going to focus a lot on Ty Felton's production?
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to Ty Felton's not going to be able to carry them forever. He's no longer, he wasn't a secret anyways. He had a good season last year, but he's no longer under the radar nationally. They do have another receiver, Caden Prather, who's really good, a bigger 6'4" guy who can make a lot of plays, so they'll look for him. And then the biggest thing for them, they have a couple of really good young tight ends as well, Dylan Wade and Preston Howard, but the biggest thing for them is to get the running game going. I know Indiana's pretty much shut down the running game. Again, same thing we'll probably say 10 times. It's not against the best competition, so maybe that's part of it. I know Charlotte had a little bit of success against them on the ground, so that'll be, I think, something Maryland tries to get going early, because they really haven't been able to get the rushing game going consistently yet this season.
There we go. Unmuted now. Yeah, so it was good questions there, Joe, and good insights. And Coach Signetti had some things to say as well as he was previewing Maryland. Let's hear what he had to say.
Well, I mean, this is going to be the stoutest defensive line we've gone against. They're really big inside, and they got good players on the outside too. And if you go 2 tight ends, they're going to bring 5 defensive linemen in, and they're very aggressive. It's also going to be the best receiving core we've seen up to this point. Probably the best quarterback we've seen up to this point. So it's the best football team we've seen up to this point. And you guys remember the game last year. It wasn't much of a game. So I'm sure they're going to come in here pretty confident, and they got a lot of the same guys. So looking forward to playing.
I'm always interested in these little coach comments and if we can read anything into them. Maryland's an interesting team. And one of the things we always talked about prior to the merciful ending of the division system was Indiana and Maryland were essentially the programs that whoever won that game was probably going to have the better season, because you had essentially kind of 2 or 3 automatic losses with Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, and everybody's fighting for scraps. So it's like, well, someone gets Rutgers, and maybe one of us can beat Michigan State. So it is interesting with both of these teams out of that mix now. There's a newfound freedom. They're very similar in terms of overall talent levels. They're very similar in terms of the S&P Plus ratings that both teams have. Maryland a bit better defensively, not as good offensively. Indiana a little bit more balanced. Nick, let me start with you. I mean, what are you looking at as the primary matchups or the things to watch for the most in this game between these two teams?
Well, I was thinking about this earlier today, actually. I mean, Ty Felton is obviously the X factor for Maryland, and it'll be interesting to see. I would think D'Angelo Pons goes up against him one-on-one. And then that, if he shuts down Ty Felton, Maryland's number 2, number 3 options, how do they factor into it? And, can they get open? Can they make a couple big plays? Can Billy Edwards get something going with his feet? How is Aiden Fisher going to do? Is he going to be like a QB spy? How's he going to be stopping the run? I think defensively, it all starts with Indiana shutting down Ty Felton. And then offensively, obviously, Indiana kind of run first, because that seems to kind of be what works best for them. And if the run doesn't work, is Curtis Rourke able to adjust?
Joe, what about you?
Yeah, I think defensively it's going to be up front. The guys was James Carpenter, Michael Kamara, the 2 on the outside, generating pressure and stopping the run. This team has generated a lot of pressure in 4 games. They have 12 sacks in 4 games, a lot of hurries, and that's forcing the quarterback play of their opponents to – they have not – I think in total passing stats, they have allowed under 500 yards in in the 4 games so far, which is kind of wild to think about, and a very low completion percentage as well. So when you see that and you see a guy like Billy Edwards, who has been slinging the rock very well, very sharp, 75% completion percentage, one of the top production quarterbacks in the country, and then a receiver like Ty Felton, who is 3rd in the nation in receiving yards, leads the Big Ten in both receiving yards and receptions. It's a defensive challenge. I think offensively they're going to be able to have their way a little bit. I don't think this Maryland defense is all that special. It's a lot of new faces. I know Kurt Signetti said a lot of returning, but this is a young core. A lot of guys with inexperience. Maybe they were there last year, but they didn't play a lot. And that's something that I was watching Michael Oxley's press conference, the head coach from Maryland, and he said that's our advantage is this inexperience we have, is that there's a lot of unknown, and I think it's going to throw some curveballs at what the IU game plan is.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me, Maryland's run defense has been fine so far in the 4 games that they played. They let Virginia run for about 4 yards a carry. They held Michigan State to under 4 yards a carry, but Indiana's averaging close to 6 yards a carry, and that has been such a huge part of their offense. And even in the game where Indiana didn't have as impressive of a running attack initially, that UCLA game, they were able to just throw the ball pretty much at will against that UCLA defense. And, that I think a lot of that was a reaction to the fact that UCLA's defensive line was, perhaps the strength of the entire defense, but they saw opportunities to pick apart the secondary, and they did that pretty regularly. Will Maryland be better than UCLA defensively? I'm not entirely sure. And I do think a lot of it is going to be ball control for Indiana and making smart decisions with the football. Thomas mentioned in the comments, like the turnover battle. Well, what's going to be interesting about that from my perspective is, of course, Indiana has yet to turn the ball over this season. And, while Maryland has turned the ball over a few times, they have a +7 turnover margin as well. Like both teams have really profited very much off of not turning the ball over and having a very high margin. If that sticks around and both teams are able to force turnovers, very different type of game. I think whoever is able to come out on that is really going to be in good shape. The other thing I guess I'll note, and it's been kind of the no pun intended, the cloud that's hanging over the game, is what's the weather going to be like? Now it's Hurricane Helen, who's about to become Major Hurricane Helen, is going to blow through the Florida Panhandle. And every projection I've seen is not ideal if you're like me and you're planning to tailgate. In fact, I'm going to quickly share my screen here because I want to give the people the information that they need. So this is the cone. If you've never seen one of these before, now this is actually a better update than I saw before. This is good. So the previous update, you see that D, which stands for tropical depression, that was previously right over Bloomington. Like you could not have drawn it over Bloomington any more clearly at 8 a.m. on Saturday. Now they've got it down in the Carbondale area of Southern Illinois at 2 o'clock on Saturday. The farther away we can keep that, on the one hand, the better for the crowd. I almost wonder if Indiana wants the tropical depression to be over the stadium, because the running attack is such a key part of what Indiana does offensively, and it's something that if the passing games are both kind of crippled a little bit by wind and rain, that takes a big part of Maryland's offense out, but Indiana's still able potentially to capitalize.
Yeah, in a rain situation, I think Indiana would thrive more than Maryland, at least on paper, in the eye test through the first 4 weeks. But I mean, from my bias as a journalist and standing on the sidelines, I would rather prefer some sunnies and 70, not 95 and sunny or pouring rain. But beggars can't be choosers. Football's still football. If I need the jacket will go on. I mean, I'm looking forward to this. It's the Big Ten home opener for Indiana. They looked so sharp through these first 4 games. I mean, Galen, for someone, you've talked about it before in one of our first episodes, someone who's been a fan longer than I've been alive. I mean, what were the feelings? Like 4-0 start.
Well, it's hard. I'll say this. I expected them to go 4-0 to start. I picked them to start the season 7-0. So, and I felt like I was out on a limb by doing that. So I am heartened, but I'm also, as someone who, is enjoying Kurt Signetti as a coach, enjoying watching the team look like they know what they're doing and be able to adapt. It is really heartening, this start and the way that they've played and the overall vibe around the football program. It's tough to put into words because even in, as we talked about, I think last time, Joe, IU's only won more than 6 games a couple of times in the last 30 years. And so to already be at 4-0 and be just that much closer to even getting to that mark is a big deal. And, Nick, when I look at this team and I think about, like, is this sustainable? I guess is kind of the big question that comes back to. What I'm seeing looks very sustainable. I would almost argue like we've seen very little of the playbook on offense. I feel like a lot of the defensive players are still coming into their own. We're seeing great performances out of guys that you maybe didn't predict that. I mean, Josh Sanguinetti, who was not a standout last year necessarily, has become one of the best defensive backs in the Big Ten under the tutelage of this coaching staff. Like, there's so much to like about the way this team is playing that I don't just feel like an irrational fan. I feel like, wow, there's some meat on the bone here.
Yeah, I try not to think too big with my predictions for this team, but I do believe that, I said it before we went to UCLA, that defense travels well. And generally speaking, like, I use, defensive front, offensive line, those things aren't really going to slump, you would think. So I do believe that, if IU's focused on the run, if they're focused on, stopping the run, they've been fantastic so far. I don't really see that going away. I do think that, teams are going to produce more than 50 rush yards per game for the rest of the season, just because the talent level gets higher. But I don't think the defense is going to fall off a cliff to the point that, they don't stay in any games. I think that IU's got, one of the deepest wide receiver rooms in the Big Ten. We saw Donovan McCulley sort of go out against FIU, and Keyshawn Williams and Miles Cross have both kind of stepped up to fill his role. And, those kinds of things will take you a long way as you go later on into the season. So I certainly think that the success that they're having in the win-loss column is sustainable from here on out.
4 guys with at least 12 catches already on the season, and none of them lead the team in touchdown receptions.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating how deep that receiving core is. And Donovan McCulley's only caught 1 ball all season. And, I think we'll slowly see him working back into the mix. But I'll tell you, the guy I've been the most impressed with out of the newcomers has been Zach Horton, not because of how good he is receiving the ball. He's such and it's just great to watch a tight end catching the ball in an Indiana uniform. It's been too long, but his ability to run block specifically in this scheme and his understanding of this offense. You mentioned earlier, like, a lot of the key pieces on offense didn't come over from JMU, but Horton being there really feels like a difference maker, and the way that he's been able to spring backs and create havoc offensively for this team, I think, is really something that could be sustainable as well. It just feels like a very meshed, coherent unit, Joe. And I feel like as we get into this next group of games, it's a really fascinating set of games. You've got Maryland, you've got at Northwestern, you've got Nebraska at home, you've got Washington at home, and you've got at Michigan State. And none of those teams, I think, if you look at them on paper, if you look at their talent levels, none of them are better than Indiana. It doesn't mean Indiana's going to win all 5, but I think Indiana's got a legitimate chance where they could win all 5, and that is a weird thing to think about right now. It is really fascinating that the Indiana's kind of got its destiny in its hands over this middle portion of the schedule, and I'm both curious and really excited. It's like a book I want to read, but I have to read like 1 chapter a week, and I can't wait to see where the narrative goes. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's only, you got to take it one game at a time, and I think that's what this team has been doing. And after that Western Illinois game, it was like, okay, we scored 77. Let's go do what we did at the Rose Bowl. And then after that, it was, okay, let's finish the non-con slate. So it's just been this straight line, all business with this team. Even when we've talked to the guys, we're like, hey, you having fun? They're like, it's just on to the next. And it's something to kind of fall in love with if you're a fan looking on the outside, whether or not you haven't watched a game yet. And I think just back with that culture that we've talked about, that a win to this upcoming Saturday, that is a 5-0 team that is now 1 win away from being bowl eligible, which in college football, that is the goal. If you are not one of the perennial powerhouses of this sport, is making a bowl game. Yeah. And I think for Indiana as a program, that should be the first goal of this season, is to make a bowl game. Second step, to win that bowl game. And maybe some of the other ones along the way is, hey, maybe go 8-4 or rather than 6-6, stuff like that. But right now they 2-6 the rest of the year, and they have achieved more success in this season than the past, 3 seasons in Indiana football. So there is something to be said about what has been built in just a very small amount of time. Again, the transfer portal was some great work that Kurt Cignetti's been able to do. And like you said, you can only take it one chapter at a time, one game at a time. But because we could look 3 weeks from now and see 2 losses on the board. There is that bye week after Northwestern. So who knows really what's at stake once the Big Ten play happens, because it is Big Ten football. Everything could come down to earth, and it could be a classic, 13-10 game.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to think about. And I think the big thing for that Charlotte game, they got out of it without major injury. Nobody got suspended. No targeting calls coming out of nowhere. Shocking how those just disappeared this week. Who knew, right? But it's going to be fascinating to watch. Nick, any final thoughts before we wrap up from you?
I'm excited for this weekend. I hope that the fan turnout is a little bit better, because weather is hopefully going to be less of an excuse. I know it was very humid. I was on top of the Memorial Stadium press box, and it was toasty up there, but I'm excited for Maryland to come to town. They seem like a very entertaining team, and I'm excited to watch Canadian Bacon, Curtis Rourke, cook again this weekend. Daniel Flick told me to coin that nickname for him. So
I thought he already had the Maple Missile. Are we changing his?
I like the Maple Missile.
I like
I
Canadian
like the Maple
Bacon.
Missile.
I'm a little biased.
I
think both are good. I think both are good.
Why are you biased towards Canadian Bacon? Is there a story I need to know about here?
I mean, Daniel just told me that it's his nickname for him, and I don't know. It just seems like Canadian Bacon's cooking. Like it just kind of works. I think. I don't know.
I do want to say Canadian Bacon is cooking. So we just saw this from CFB numbers. This is if you look at the PFF offensive grade and then the ESPN QBR rating. Look up in the top right there. We got our guy Curtis Rourke alongside Cam Ward, Jackson Dart. I mean, this is some rarefied air for Curtis to be in, and to kind of Joe. To go to you for final thoughts, maybe to lead into that. I mean, it's been so impressive. We mentioned this last week, I think, like how well and how quickly Curtis Rourke has learned this offense, has taken control of the offense, and has put himself in a position where every week he's being talked about as the statistical leader in college football in some way, shape, or form. That's a great spot for him to be in. And I'm glad that, after a year due to injury where he wasn't really able to play and get that kind of attention, he's been able to do that here.
Yeah, I think with Curtis Rourke, he kind of exemplifies what the entire team is about: experience and maturity. And like we talked to him, he's all business, like I said before, but he goes in, does a good work, and the next thing he wants to do is improve for the next week. And a guy that's in his 6th year of college football is looking to improve. He's not in it for, the luxurious fame that some NIL big winners get in this era of college football that we find ourselves in. But it seems like, I'll ask you this one. It seems like IU has their guy at quarterback for the first time in a long time. And you could say Michael Penix was that guy in that 2020 year, but once again, that was the COVID year. That was very weird. IU's out to a 4-0 start for the first time since the COVID year, and some people don't even claim that as a 4-0 start. So apples to oranges, I guess.
The mighty Steve just noted we've got Canadian Bacon to Waffle House.
It writes itself.
I like it.
We're gonna revisit this, Nick. We might have to workshop this a little bit in the Commons this week, but we will have.
Is a little better.
I don't know. What?
If we're gonna vote,
we will caucus on this, and we will talk about it more as we move forward. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. Thanks to everybody who tuned in and watched. And just noon kick, weather, just go. I don't care if it's raining a little bit, no big deal. I actually think Memorial Stadium in the rain is an underrated pleasure, especially when it's not cold, and as long as it's not like that Virginia game from about 6 years ago where it was like raining buckets and sideways and everything. It's not going to do that. I can almost guarantee you. But anyway, we'd love to see you folks out there. And gentlemen, I really appreciate you taking the time to join as well. Our thanks to Jeff Ehrman from Maryland 24/7 site and Nick Rodecap. Welcome. Great to have you on Bison Chat for the first time. We'll have you back on again soon. And Joe Cronin, my co-host, really appreciate all your work with everything and putting this together. And, of course, the delightful Emily Fox behind the scenes, pushing the buttons and making the magic happen. For all of those folks, I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining us here on Tuesday Night Bison Chat. We'll be back with more Crimson Cast later on this week. We've got Taylor Lehman joining us. We've got Crimson Cash, where we give you some betting advice for the week. And then, of course, on Sunday, tune in as Scott and I on Crimson Cast will be breaking down what happened in the IU Maryland game. For all those folks, like I said, I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you on the flip side. So long, everybody.